Today on Rational Animal, we're going to be talking about the Japanese American experience during the Second World War. All right, well, Jordan, thanks for being on Rational Animal today. If you could you give us an introduction to who you are, what your background is, and what your academic background is, the reason for why you went into the academic area that you did?
Absolutely. So my name is Jordan Kojima. I'm American, but Japanese American. And as far as my academic background, I studied history in my undergrad at Queen's University of Charlotte, and then I also studied history at UNC Charlotte, and I also studied history there as well. My focus is Japanese American history, actually. Now, I'm interested in plenty of other subjects, but I've spent probably the better part of my life studying Japanese Americans and our group's uh, contributions and struggles in America. And and honestly, that family history is why I got into this whole academic subject and why I've studied it for so long. So yeah, that's in a nutshell why I study it.
Great. And today we have the pleasure of talking about the role of Japanese in World War II, right? And like what role they played, and also a little bit about the Japanese internment camps.
Yes, absolutely. So, yeah, I'd love to talk about the internment camps. It's been discussed more freely in today's age, but it's not a topic people know about often, and or they just kind of know about it, and so it's often kind of glazed over. And also, people forget our people group also fought in the war. And granted, it wasn't a huge number, but uh, and for example, a lot of people just discuss the Tuskegee Airmen. They're very popular, but and a lot of people forget that the Japanese Americans also fought in our own unit. So it's part of World War II history, which I've always enjoyed studying.
So how were Japanese Americans viewed uh, in their war effort? Like, were they viewed with suspicion early on, or
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, and if you, it's one of those sad things in history that you read, and people will often glaze over this fact, but there was a lot of discrimination against us back then, and it lingered for a long time, and it is just a sad part of American history. But that's why the internment camps were actually started in the first place. A lot of um, like Franklin Roosevelt, the President Roosevelt didn't like us, and so that's why he issued his Executive Order 9066. That's the reason I know it is it's very famous for our group because that's the order that put all the or that declared all Japanese Americans or should be forcibly relocated to the internment camps. And so there's a lot of misunderstandings too about how that all went and the process. And yeah, just even those stories are very tragic. And I mean, half my family's from Hawaii, and the other half's from the mainland, California. And so a lot of times people forget that there was two different, very different experiences during the war.
so what were the um, when did Japanese get involved? When did Japanese Americans get involved in the war effort, and what did that look like?
So the Japanese were involved with the war effort from the beginning because a lot of people forget there was over 100,000 Japanese in Hawaii at the time. And my great uncles, my grandmother, and my dad's side of my family's from Hawaii. They were old enough to see the smoke of Pearl Harbor. They lived close enough that they could see the fires, and they lived on the plantations and they worked on the plantations. And Hawaii eventually went into martial law, but a lot of people didn't. One of the parts that people forget, Japanese people did used to work on the military bases because they'd help bring food or help, do services for the army there. And because of the war effort, they were banned. They were banned from the bases, and there was a very strict curfew for anyone that was of Japanese descent, and it was very different. They didn't get There was a little bit of deportations if you were suspected of being a spy, but there was a much smaller minority got sent to those camps.
What does the timeline look like in terms of like Pearl Harbor happens and immediately um, Japanese Americans are now suspect, and how are they treated at that point, like that early on in the war effort?
Absolutely. Well, they banned us. They banned the Japanese from the military bases pretty quick, especially on Hawaii, and they did a very intense search. Interrogating people. The Justice Department arrested a lot of Japanese people. If you had articles or Japanese artifacts in your home, a lot of times they were confiscated. Whether that was priceless family heirloom or whether that was, like for example, my my grandmother's father, my great grandfather, on my dad's side, he was a school teacher, a Japanese school teacher, and as a result, had a lot of Japanese documents. And um, they gave him a choice. He could go to a justice camp in, I believe it was, might have been Idaho, but there was a couple. I can't. That's actually a family history thing. I'm looking up now, trying to figure out where he went. But um, they gave him a choice. Either you're a family of 8 kids and your wife can go to a regular family camp on the mainland, or it can be just you. And he didn't want to uproot all the family and go to the mainland, so he just went by himself. Um, that choice wasn't given to the people on the mainland, but in Hawaii, that was what they did.
So what role did the Japanese Americans play in the war effort? Because it sounds like you were saying they were also fighting. Um,
Yes. So so just to give you an example of a timeline, as you mentioned, Pearl Harbor is December, early December, and the internment order wasn't given until February 6th, I believe, or very early February 1942. And that's when President FDR created the camps or the idea for the camps. It took a little bit longer for them to implement that from a logistic standpoint, but that's the date we consider when it started because pretty much after that point they put flyers up in your neighborhood if you were Japanese, and it said all people of Japanese ancestry must report to a staging area, and you could only bring what you could carry, and you had to leave. So that was in California, and the West Coast. Um, and so, just an example, so just to discuss that really quick. So, like my mother's side of the family is from the mainland, from California and the West Coast area, and they lost their property because of this. My One of my great grandfathers had a grocery store, and he only had 3 days to sell it. So um, he had to sell it for $5, the whole grocery store, everything in it, because the person wasn't willing to give him a fair price. And he was going to be gone for no one knew how long. They didn't tell him. They just said, "You're going to be gone." And then my other part of my family, they were farmers and they lost their farmland because of that. Um, People sometimes in very good circumstances, the Japanese people's neighbors would protect their land or property. But if you didn't have a good neighbor, a good Samaritan, then you were most likely going to lose all your stuff. So,
were timelines and things like that up to local authorities, or was that
no, oh, that's a good question. Sorry. No, it was actually the military. The military issued it. It was a military district. It was martial law at that time in the U.S. or that part of America, and so the War Department, what would later become the Department of Defense, was in charge of that. So this is all the Army pretty much doing this.
okay? So FDR issues this order, and then the military kind of carries out the details of how that's carried out.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
So it's because we're under wartime footing, and FDR is the commander in chief. He ordered the military to create camps to house the Japanese.
And what was the order specifically saying in terms of like what was he saying had to take place?
All Japanese persons on the West Coast and what they designated as a military zone, the Japanese had moved past that line. So Japanese were not allowed to live or be at a certain a certain point close to the West Coast. So I don't remember exactly where the line was arbitrarily, but it was pretty much they moved everybody east. So there's very few, like a very few Japanese lived west of the Rocky Mountains at that time. So if you lived past the Rocky Mountains, they generally didn't bother you because um, they weren't concerned about you. But because there were so many Japanese in California and Seattle and Oregon, that they thought we should just move all these people.
Do you have a rough idea of how many there were at that time?
Yes, it was the estimate. It depends who's counting, but it's roughly 120,000, I believe.
Okay. And these were American citizens.
I yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
It's a rather interesting conversation. So the there's a first generation Issei in Japanese. It's Issei just means first generation in Japanese. And there's also Nisei, and they're the second generation. E is one in Japanese, Ni is two. So a little bit of fun fact about Japanese there. But the Issei were not citizens. Actually, there was laws in America, and also by a Supreme Court interpretation, Japanese people couldn't become citizens, because the way the Constitution was interpreted at that time was that only black or white people could become citizens. And so if you were Mexican or or Hispanic, or Mexicans were mostly just immigrant laborers, just like the Japanese at that time. So it was a very interesting scenario where the Mexican immigrants and the Japanese and other Chinese, other Asian immigrants were classified in this very gray area where we weren't allowed to become citizens. And so very early on in the immigration process, a lot of my great-grandparents experienced a lot of discrimination because California had the most notorious law, but it forbid any Japanese national from owning property. So, and so it was very hard for that first generation to live because they weren't allowed to legally own the farms they worked. But then because of the way the Constitution is worded, again, my grandparents who were born on the American soil are technically Americans because by birth. And so it's this very strange situation where their parents can never become American citizens, but their kids are born American citizens.
Sure. Yeah, so was that did that serve as a basis for maybe separating families or anything like that during the internment, or?
No, thankfully they didn't separate families. You were allowed to stay with your family, but everyone, whether you were a American citizen or not, had to take a loyalty test, which, if you think about it, was kind of a strange thing. It's pretty much, it was yes or no questions like, are you going to betray the United States of America, or are you loyal to the United States of America? It was like a yes or no box.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very what's the word, controversial thing, because most Japanese people, so they were loyal, but then there was a group of people, a few thousand, that purposefully, I would say maybe not all of them, but most of them purposefully refused to take the test because they felt it was not fair to them to have to prove their loyalty like that.
Did the ones that said that they were loyal, did they have any sense of, or is there any indication that they had a sense that maybe, well, okay, they are at war with the country we came from, like, so we can kind of understand that our loyalties may not be. Was there any of that, you think, in their mindset?
Japanese people, by our culture, are very non-confrontational. It's a very conformist culture, and so the elders in the community thought it was wise to take the test and just to go through the motions. And so as a result of that, there is the children often would just do it just to conform. And uh, how to say this? It's so the people that didn't conform to that were very much the outlying group in that regard. But no, it was very difficult for them because uh, you have to realize that again, these people are taking these loyalty tests. They're literally carrying every possession they own. They weren't allowed to take anything they couldn't carry.
Hmm.
So all of their possessions were um, what they could carry. My family had suitcases of clothes and a couple belongings, and that's about it. So that was just the reality of the camps, really.
Rephrase this. Do you think early Japanese Americans were divided in terms of their view of Western culture? Something like along the lines of the Tokugawa era versus the Meiji Restoration in Japan, right? Like I would think there'd probably be sort of traditionalist sympathies,
Mm-hmm.
and then you also have folks that were probably sympathetic to the Meiji Restoration and uh, Japanese's sort of embrace of the West. Uh, am I off base there in thinking that maybe there were at least maybe those kind of two camps of people who had immigrated to the United States from Japan?
Um, he, not really. It's something to, how should I put this? Something about Japan is that people are very prideful of their nation. So Japanese people, even though they came to America, very much love their homeland still, and they like a lot of them came for economic opportunity, um, and it actually created a big divide between the first and the second generation, especially as they grew up, because the second generation, they enjoyed the American lifestyle, they enjoyed American culture, the movies, all these things that are American, but their parents, who grew up in Japan and very traditional Japanese, are not. And so there was very much a clash of those values, um, going back to the early 1920s, 1930s. And the war had a very significant impact on that generational divide. But um, no, it was a lot of Japanese people were very proud of their heritage because you have to remember up until that war, Japan was a very successful nation. It was very strong allies with America until the 1920s. America is the one that, helped Japan become the empire that it became. And so there was a lot of, close ties between the two countries. Like for example, one example of the very close ties between the two countries is Admiral Yamamoto, who was in charge of the Pearl Harbor attack. Was trained. He was educated at Harvard, I believe, or Yale, one of the Ivy League schools. I can't remember off the top of my head, and he was educated in Western arts there, and he grew to love America in a certain way, and of course he was always loyal to his homeland. But one of the very interesting facts, if you study the Japanese side of the World War II, is Admiral Yamamoto actually very famously and very poignantly told Japanese high command and the military, if we go to a war with America, I can give you 6 months. He gave himself 6 months to hold off the American military before it would just become a war of attrition and Japan would never win because America just had too many people, had too much industry. And the irony of that statement is that 6 months after Pearl Harbor is Midway, and Midway is considered the turning point of the war
Wow, yeah,
because America destroyed most of the Imperial Japan's aircraft carriers.
right,
So there is an irony to that comment because it happened literally almost 6 months to the day.
right. Wow. Yeah, so I want to get a little bit back to the role that Japanese Americans actually did play in the war. Not just that they were relocated, but you mentioned that they actually did fight, right?
They did.
Is
They
that
did.
later on in the war, or was that early on in the war? Like what did that look like?
Good, that's a good question. It's a complicated question, as many things are. So before the war, there was actually some Japanese Americans in the National Guard, or what would the National Guard that we think of today is very different than what it was then. because right now the U.S. Army trains the National Guard, so that's why the National Guard looks like the Army. It's the Army finances the National Guard in a way, or subsidizes it. But back then it wasn't, and so there was kind of a homegrown unit for the National Guard in Hawaii, and it was kind of a home guard. But after the war broke out, they disbanded it because they didn't trust them. But then and very quickly though, they reformed it, and there was only enough for a battalion-sized group. So one of the interesting parts of the Japanese American contribution early on was they took homegrown guards, and they had enough to make a battalion, which is about 1,000 men. And the military was still segregated back then, and a lot of people forget that. But so they weren't allowed to be with white people or black people. And so this first battalion was actually sent overseas very quickly, or relatively speaking. And after they were sent, President Roosevelt, in the middle of 1942, towards the end of 1942, had the great idea of trying to get Japanese Americans to enlist from the camps. So recruiters went to the internment camps and asked people if they wanted to volunteer. And most people were not very excited about that opportunity. And some, of course, did sign up, and then in Hawaii, it was much more accepted to do that. Whereas the internment camps, it was much harder to volunteer after your government has taken away all your earthly possessions, pretty much. So they formed a new unit. It was called the 442nd, and it was called a Regimental Combat Team, which means, for those of you who don't know, a regiment is below a division as far as size. A division is roughly 4,000 soldiers. So our regiment is a little bit over 1,000 to 1,500, depending how you're counting it. And so when it's called a combat team, because it's supposed to be, what's the word? All of the different kinds of units are involved in that combat team. So what I mean by that is, when you have a division size, which is about, again, 4,000 to 5,000 men, you typically will have supply officers, a supply company, you'll have artillery, you'll have scouts, all these different kinds of groups involved in that. And regiments, sometimes they're just combat regiments. And they'll have obviously their own specialties going down forward. But with a regimental combat team, the idea is that all of those different pieces all are together in one command structure. And so it's very similar, but it's just smaller, if you will, to a division. So early on, there was about 1,000 men who'd already been enlisted and trained by the military in Hawaii. So they were sent as a group to Italy. The Japanese typically did not fight on the Western Front, or I should say the Pacific Front, because the U.S. military did not trust Japanese people or the other American soldiers to not fire on Japanese Americans. And so the only people that were deployed to the Western or the Pacific theater was the like translators. So some Japanese Americans served as translators or interrogators of other Japanese soldiers. But as far as combat units, that would be they were all sent to Italy, and as well as Germany and France. So the 442nd is the unit that would become the most famous, and its nickname is the Purple Heart Battalion because it did suffer, I believe, the most statistically out of any unit in the war. It was called the Purple Heart Battalion because it suffered, I believe, 120% casualty rate. So those are people that got injured once or twice or multiple times at least. And the unit was also replenished a lot. So there might have been, for example, 4,000 people at the start, but you had over 10,000 people serve in total in that unit because of deaths, because of replacements, things like that. And in the 3 years the 442nd fought in Europe, it actually became the most decorated unit in all of U.S. Army history. From a number standpoint, it has the most medals because of those Purple Hearts. And some people might say that's inflated, but it is the unit with the most, I believe, medals of honor for one unit, given its lifespan. So it became a very significant military contribution for the U.S. Army history. And the 442nd still serves as the National Guard for Hawaii. They still use that designation. Um, so it's still an active unit, which is really exciting, and it's a very prideful thing for the group. But now it's desegregated. Of course, the military was desegregated after World War II, but there's a very proud tradition in that unit, and it's just a very unique part of the U.S. Army history.
Yeah, so you're saying in this combat unit you've got Japanese Americans who are infantry, you've got pilots, you have pretty much every military role. Is that?
So not pilots. That would be the U.S. Air Force. So
Oh.
the U.S. Air Force didn't exist back then. It was called the U.S. Army Air Corps.
Hmm.
But Japanese Americans were not allowed into that. It's a very different designation. But they were all combat soldiers. But they did have medics, cooks, all that sort of thing, artillerymen in that 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And yeah, the unit has a lot of crazy stories. It landed in Italy in July, and it fought at famous battles like Monte Cassino. It fought all the way up to the Gothic line and the Siegfried line in Germany. And just another interesting fact about the 442nd Service is they helped liberate some French towns. And there's just very funny stories coming out of France because French people in the French countryside have never seen an Asian person in their life. And so they just see these Asian people with American uniforms on walking down their streets. And they're just really confused because they recognize the uniforms, but they don't recognize the people wearing them. And so people would ask things like, "Where are you from?" And for Europeans, they who had never heard of Hawaii or Japanese culture or anything like that, the language and the phrases confused them because, a lot of people were from Honolulu. So they'd say, "Oh, I'm from Honolulu," which for a European who's never heard of Hawaii, it's just like, that just sounds like a foreign country because it is. And so one of the very interesting facts is that in these very two, I believe it's called Bruyere, and the one might be Bifontaine, I think, and forgive my French pronunciation, but there are memorials to the Japanese Americans who fought and liberated those towns. I believe they have a Honolulu Street in their cities because they're honoring the unit that liberated them from the Germans.
Hmm. How were they received after they served? Do you know when they? Are there letters that kind of speak to how they were treated? Was sentiment pretty quickly reversed?
Unfortunately, it wasn't. So, in a way, and the War Department actually realized this very quickly, and there's internal memos that talk about they're very scared of releasing the Japanese Americans from the camps because the West Coast is very paranoid, and they know that if they release them, they might cause race riots in like Los Angeles and other things. And there were some protests and some rioting, nothing to the extent of like what blacks or African Americans have experienced, but there's some very famous pictures of neighborhoods that said like no Japs allowed or no Japs wanted. Japs is the derogatory name for Japanese as far as our history, but there's very very famous stories back then of a Japanese serviceman in their uniform going to a barber shop and people saying we don't cut your hair. So in a lot of ways, the same way a lot of African Americans and Black Americans who served face that kind of discrimination coming home. It maybe not as intense in some areas, but our people also experience that same unfortunate reality coming home.
Do you mind if we turn back a little bit to the internment camp?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so what was life like in an internment camp?
That's a good question. So for those of you who don't know, the internment camps, there are different kinds. They had what you would um, there was the internment camps are kind of the end result, but then you also have like a staging camp that everyone would gather, like a focal point where everyone would gather. And the word escapes me at this moment, but there's a name for those staging areas. But for example, Manzanar is a very famous one. And a lot of those staging areas eventually became internment camps because there wasn't enough places to put people. But a lot of the times, these internment camps were um, uh, repurposed horse track stables. That Topaz is a very famous one. That's in Arizona. And there was a lot of times the U.S. military had to build a facility and then house people and guard them because that was just how they were logistically handling it. And the U.S. Army complained about it, of course, because feeding 120,000 people and and having to have guards walk around the camp was a burden on them, and so they didn't really appreciate that. But that's just that. And so, as far as in the camps, um, there's very different experiences, and this is where the the history of the Japanese Americans is very interesting. Is that the internment camps were definitely not like the camps we think of in Europe with the Nazis. And so there is a tendency in America, there's two attitudes in American history regarding the internment camps. There are those who play up the Japanese Americans had everything taken from them, and there are those that say that the internment camps weren't that bad because they weren't death camps. And I think both of those are fallacies. Because they don't acknowledge the emotional and material loss that these people suffered, but at the same time, people sometimes don't realize that the camps had a very different effect on the different generations. And what I mean by that is, if you were younger, if you were a child, a lot of kids liked it. And the reason I say they liked it is because they were allowed all of a sudden to do things they would never have been allowed to do if they had lived in a very inclusive Japanese community. And what the camps actually did is give their kids a lot of freedom and opportunity, to meet other kids, to do other things, to try, a lot of like different activities they would never have had the opportunity had they been, in a Japanese American neighborhood in Los Angeles. But if you're older, it's much more traumatic because you're watching a lot of things and things you value get stripped away. And so based on your age, there's generally a very different kind of experience. And I'm not saying that's every young person liked it and every older person hated it.
Sure.
But it was very interesting learning that because I talked to one of my family friends, and she's unfortunately passed away about, I think, 8 years ago. But she was a young schoolgirl, and she remembered just having a lot of freedom, being able to run around and do what she wanted, because her parents were kind of lost, and her parents were still really emotionally struggling with, the internment, and as a result, it gave her a lot more freedom, which most Japanese families wouldn't give their children had they been in a environment they could control.
Were they treated? I guess in the camps, were they given 3 square meals a day? Were they given like reasonable accommodations? What did that look like?
That's a good question. Well, they were given food. You generally like kind of a U.S. Army style. So whatever the U.S. Army could get is what they fed them. The Japanese Americans were the ones cooking generally or cleaning and doing most of the legwork. So the U.S. Army did supply them, but there were other issues, of course. And there were actually some protests and some riots in the camps on some occasions. As far as work, and life and accommodations. In some camps, they paid you a little bit of money to do certain jobs, um, but that was very rare. Um, and as far as accommodations, they were pretty bare. A lot because the U.S. Army didn't have a lot of time and or resources to make these camps. They pretty much just gave them a bag and said, there's a pile of straw. You can make a straw bed." And a lot of these people, had to live in these very barrack style buildings or stables that were turned into barracks, um, and that just became where they lived. And bathrooms were community, there was no dividers, and bathing too. And so for a lot of Japanese, that was a little humiliating because you're having to share everything like that, and there's no privacy. So it there was a lot of struggle with that, and a lot of emotional hurt because of the whole experience. And that's actually been one of the very well documented historical studies, is that there was a very much a traumatic shared experience with the Japanese American group because of that, and it affected a lot of things after the war.
Were there any attempts at compensation for those who lost businesses and lost houses and lost things like that?
Yeah, there was an early attempt in the late 40s, 48, I believe. You could get something like $1,500 if they felt that you deserved it, which you didn't always qualify in their minds, and it wasn't a lot of money for what they were asking. And so a lot of people didn't get the money, or they didn't apply, and so unfortunately there wasn't a lot of compensation given. It was pretty much when you left the internment camp, you took your bags, they gave you a train ticket and $5, and they sent you on a train.
Is there much knowledge among current Japanese Americans of what happened? Is it something that's just been forgotten? Is it something that in general they have the same kind of knowledge that anyone else would have of the Japanese internment?
Um, yes and no. It's a good question, and it's a very complicated answer, of course. But I would say that mostly no, because my grandparents' generation was very traumatized by that experience, very ashamed of being Japanese, and for an honor culture, that's a very big deal. And for example, most Japanese Americans changed their names to American names after the war, or during the war if they were able to. So, for example, I had 14 great aunts and uncles on in Hawaii, and all of them but maybe one changed their names to English names. And so as a result of that, I have a couple Aunt Carols, a couple Freds, a couple Johns, but they picked names that were very American because they didn't want to be known by, their Japanese names. And most of them forgot. Some of them actually forgot it because they just didn't want to remember. And then on top of that, there was it is a very strange relationship with your culture, because you don't want to be singled out because of that culture, because America just fought a war with that culture, and so they're not particularly thrilled to have people celebrating a Japanese event or festival. And at the same, that is a part of your identity, and so it created a very difficult dynamic in the community, because a lot of the grandparents never explained to my parents' generation how they felt or their experiences. And so it wasn't until my grandparents were older that they felt comfortable enough to share a little bit. And even then, it was only a little bit. So it's very difficult to even have that conversation now. And then as a result of that too, in a way, it fractured the ethnic group in ways that other ethnic groups have not been fractured. So,
Do you have more any more elaboration on what you mean by that?
which part?
That there was a fracturing in that community that's unlike fracturing in other communities.
Yes. So, because of internment, um, a lot of Japanese people moved moved away from the West Coast. About 25% of uh, the Japanese Americans didn't return. And so a lot of these ethnic neighborhoods that used to exist before the war were either bought up by other people, probably white people, but and so those neighborhoods were no longer communities for them. So these what had used to be a bastion or a safety place for Japanese no longer existed. So they had to build it elsewhere. But because of the nature of development, they weren't able to always stay in the same area anymore. And so whereas you might have a very strong ethnic conclave of Hispanics, of different groups or nationalities, or blacks, African Americans, or whoever, Japanese people didn't have that anymore. I mean, they tried, but it was very much a facsimile of what it had been at one point. And so even now, if you go to Japantown in Los Angeles, there's not a lot of Japanese anymore. Whereas if you went to other ethnic conclaves in Los Angeles, it'd be pretty strong. So historically, Japantown was a very thriving community, but now there's barely any Japanese people living there anymore. So that's just one of the sad realities of what happened.
What do you think are some lessons that can be learned uh, from these events, from the fact that there were Japanese Americans fighting in the Western Front?
Being American is something we should value, and that a lot of Japanese people were willing to fight for a country that didn't protect their own people's rights. And that I think that says a lot. And they were willing to fight and die for that homeland, even though, again, their families are still in camps and they had everything taken away. But and I think that's part of a very unique part of the American experience is that you have people groups, even the African Americans and blacks, have that also as part of their story. That a lot of people forget that they were willing to fight. A lot of them were willing to fight at least for America, and it's just one of those interesting parts that even though our culture and our society has had a lot of divides and a lot of inequality in a lot of ways, um, there is still something there at the core that as citizens it can unite us. And I just wonder if we can learn from those lessons today, because I think it's something that sometimes we miss in today's dialogue and today's discourses.
Do you think we could end with a story, maybe a story that kind of hits home what it was like for Japanese Americans during the war? Maybe a war story of some sort?
Yeah, there's a lot of stories, but my favorite war story um, is about a Japanese American soldier. He was an officer, and it was towards the very end of the war. They're fighting on the Germans in some mountains on the French border, and this this officer was in charge of some men trying to take a hill, and there was two machine gun nests on this hill, and his men became pinned down by the fire, and they couldn't move. So they're all laying on the ground, and they're stuck. And so he decides to, as the officer, which is dangerous, especially because you're supposed to be the leader, he stands up and exposes himself to fire and runs up the flank or the side of the machine gun nest and leads a group of men, and they charge the machine gun nest. Um, he uses all of his ammunition in his rifle, and he successfully takes out the first nest. He destroys it, and uh, he's running to the second one, and he crawls up to it, and he's about to throw a grenade into it, and he stands up to throw it, and a German soldier stands up and shoots him, and he falls down, and as he's laying on the ground after getting shot, he realizes the German has shot his right arm at the elbow, which is the hand that's actually holding the grenade. So he picks the now live grenade up with his left hand and throws it at the Germans, and it kills a few of them. And then he takes his sidearm out, his Colt 45, and then charges the rest of the way and kills a German or two, and then also captures the rest. And so he's actually and he's also been hit. I believe he got hit in the side at one point as well with a bullet. But he's lost an arm pretty much, or it's mostly off at this point. And he was so determined to stay with his men that the medics had to drag him off the hill. Two medics had to forcibly put him on a stretcher and drag him back down the hill to get first aid attention because of the blood loss. And many years later, when that Japanese American soldier returned home to Hawaii, he decided to go into politics, and he was elected as the first Japanese American senator from Hawaii. His name was Daniel Inouye, and he's his story is very significant because when you're sworn in as a congressman, you must swear with your right hand on the Bible, and he's one of the first people that couldn't do that. And so they let him raise his left hand as a result. He had to during his induction ceremony, he said, I'm not able to raise my right hand. And so there was a certain amount of gravitas given to him because of his service. And he, I believe, received a Distinguished Cross for it. Maybe it was the Medal of Honor, I forget. But it is I think for me, it's a very interesting story. It's a much crazy story, as war stories often are. But it's a story of a Japanese American who sacrificed a lot for his country and then served in Congress for the rest of his life. And he passed away, only about 10 or 15 years ago. So it is sad that he's gone, but his story is just a story very much of sacrifice, but also love of his country. And then, he did a lot for Japanese Americans and other Asian Americans that came to America after World War II. So very much a great war story, but it's obviously much more than that.
Great. Jordan, thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.